So welcome everybody to this new NIA series, which we have termed NIA-logues. It's actually an experiment, but we are hoping this will continue. It's a COVID child. It is something that was born within this pandemic period. We wanted people to sit and talk very relaxed, without moderation and with a common topic. So that was the first idea for NIA-logues. And another very important point I would like to stress is the fact that we want to connect Norway and Greece under a very different perspective. So we want to bring Norwegian academics, Professor Søren Handberg, and Greek academics, although they work in different countries, Professor Alexandros Laftsidis, and start a dialogue between our countries, big networks, and hopefully continue the dialogue in a different format later on. I hope you all know NIA. It's a foreign school started in 1989, and now we are under Bergen University. This is our sole owner, and we are proud to announce that Bergen and Oslo are keeping the collaboration after some turbulent years. So we welcome you again. Our new colleague, Paschalis Zafiriadis, Dr. Paschalis Zafiriadis, will introduce our speakers. Enjoy the night and keep in touch with our social media, YouTube, and our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia, for introducing NIA-logues. So before I proceed with presenting our speakers, I would also like to thank you for joining us tonight for the opening lecture of NIA-logues. As Delia said, it's a COVID child, okay, aka too much free time, probably, to think about things. So we have been working on the launching of NIA-logues with great anticipation. Admittedly, we feel the excitement of experimenting with something new, or at least attempting to do so. For this reason, we will gratefully be looking forward to your feedback after the end of the first NIA-logues lecture. Our speakers tonight, Professor Søren Handberg and Dr. Alexandros Laftsidis, and I should mention here that I will be presenting them to you alphabetically, are two well-established classical archaeology scholars with a special interest in the Hellenistic world, and more specifically in its pottery. Pottery, the so-called Hellenistic koine, is tonight's topic of discussion. To proceed faster to our lecture tonight, I will provide you with a short version of our speakers' academic backgrounds. Please feel free to ask more about them after the lecture during our reception. Søren Handberg is an associate professor of classical and digital archaeology in the Department of Archaeology, Conservation and History at the University of Oslo. Before landing at the University of Oslo, Søren served as an assistant director of the Danish Institute at Athens and as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of History and Classical Studies at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. The University of Aarhus is also his alma mater, as he received all his undergraduate and graduate degrees from this university. His academic interests lie in the archaeology and history of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea regions, from the Bronze Age to the Roman imperial period, though focusing on ancient Greek world in the period from the Iron Age to the Hellenistic times. These interests culminated through the years in his participation under various capacities, academic capacities, in many classical archaeology projects in Greece, Italy, and Ukraine, always focusing on the pottery finds of this project. He is currently the co-director of the Calydon Archaeological Project in Anatolia, Greece. Professor Handberg has produced numerous peer-reviewed individual and co-authored publications as an outcome of his engagement with Calydon and elsewhere. His most recent publications, to name a few among many, involve a co-edited volume titled Ascending and Descending the Acropolis, Movement in Athenian Religion, and another co-edited volume alongside Dr. Gadol, titled Material Koine in the Greek Early Iron Age and Archaic Period. The topic of pottery consumption on regional and local scales in the classical world and its application as a heuristic and interpretative tool to address the production of social and cultural identities has informed a large part of his published work, both for his projects in Greece and elsewhere. Similar pottery-based topics and interests transcend most of the research and publication work of our other speaker, Dr. Alexandros Laftsidis. Alexandros is a Marie Curie postdoctoral researcher at the research center Crea Patrimoine at the Libre University of Brussels. Alexandros' academic interests focus on the archaeology of the classical and the Hellenistic world, and specifically on aspects of its pottery production. He is currently researching the Hellenistic period through the lens of socioeconomic complexities afforded by the evidence of pottery production and consumption. Before moving to the Libre University of Brussels, Dr. Laftsidis taught as an adjunct and visiting assistant professor for the University of Cyprus and Xavier University in the US. He received his master's and PhD degrees from the Classics Department at the University of Cincinnati, and he got another master's and bachelor's degree from the Archaeology Department of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. He is currently engaged in numerous archaeological projects in Greece, such as in Itanos excavation and study projects, and in the Samothrace Archaeological Survey, serving as a ceramic specialist. Alexandros' published work includes numerous individual and co-authored papers in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, such as the paper titled Setting a Common Table for the Hellenistic World, Revisiting Hellenistic Ceramic Koiné, included in the published proceedings of the volume titled Exploring the Neighborhood, The Role of Ceramics in Understanding Place in the Hellenistic World. He has also been the co-editor of the volume Toi Didaskaloi, a volume in honor of Professor Ioannis Akamatis. Needless to mention that both our speakers have a solid teaching experience on classical archaeology courses and numerous and illustrious record of research funding and scholarly affiliations. Though getting into this sort of detail would only prolong the agony for launching NIA. Before I leave you with our speakers, allow me to refer briefly to the backstory of tonight's lecture. The topic and content of this lecture was exclusively produced by the speaker, and trust me, this is not a disclaimer. NIA-logues' mentality is to bring scholars together and give them the freedom to creatively interact with each other to promote collaboration and dissemination of knowledge. My role here today, apart from choosing wisely, if I may say so, these two top-notch scholars, is to facilitate their discussion. So please join me in welcoming our first NIA-logues speakers, the pioneers. Are we set?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So, koiné, which is the point of interest, the topic of tonight's lecture. So, what exactly do we mean by the term koiné, and why is the term applicable to the Hellenistic period? And if you allow me to add one more question to this multi-layered question, when and how was the term koiné employed in conjunction with the material culture of the Hellenistic period?
Okay, let's take it one by one. Right? So first, I should start by saying that the term koiné, and this is not going to come as a surprise for most of you, was first used in the area of linguistics. What is important here and interesting, and this comes to contrast with what is happening with the Hellenistic ceramic koiné that we're going to discuss later, is the fact that the linguistic koiné was first used by the ancient users of this language. We first see in the starting the 3rd, 2nd century BC, already some commentators such as Georgios Kyrovoskus or the commentator on Dionysius the Thrax to use this term. They speak of a kini dialectos, a common dialect. So it was something that was already understandable within each other, and as a term we see it being in use already as long as at least the 10th century AD. So it comes as no surprise that the term koiné was taken by the area of linguistics and later on used in the area of material culture. Of course, in that case, as Yannis Galanakis very nicely notes, it is an ethic approach, right? Not an emic one. It's an ethic approach because this is the result of modern observation.
Yes, thank you for pointing this out. I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. This distinction between emigenetic approach and the pedigree of the term koine when we try to apply it to our analysis of pottery or any type of material culture. And in fact, the term has been used for more than 100 years. First mention is Dietrich Fimmen 100 years ago, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then subsequently it's been used to describe sort of perceived commonalities in material culture from the Aegean Late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean koine, talk about the so-called Eubøan koine in Eubøa with Lefkandi as a main site, and then the northern Aegean and part of the mainland, and Thessaly and Boeotia and Oropos. And we as archaeologists have also spoken about the West Greek koine in the early Iron Age, and sort of a proto-geometric koine in pottery in Achaea and Aetolia, Achaemonia, Elis, and these areas. So it's been quite well used, and that's why I think also it's an interesting topic to discuss, because it is being used. And in terms of Hellenistic pottery, first use was by Werner Technau, and discussing pottery from Samos, Hellenistic pottery, in 1929, and he talks a little bit about sort of the commonality of Hellenistic pottery in general, in morphology and also in production methods, while at the same time recognizing also some local deviations from this sort of common Hellenistic pottery scheme.
Yeah, and if I may add, what is really interesting here is that Werner Technau in 1929, when he first introduced this term in the area of Hellenistic ceramics, he wasn't the first. You would expect that since this is the Hellenistic language, Koine language that we speak about, and we take the term as an analogy from this language, that the area of Hellenistic material culture, may it be ceramics, sculpture, or anything else, would be the first area to be employed, for this term to be employed. But this wasn't the case. Archaeologists in the Aegean Bronze Age were the first to use it in terms of material culture, and later on it was used by people working on Hellenistic pottery. Even though this is not really important, but I find it very interesting. But the topic, it's still very much really a hot topic nowadays still. I was noticing being increasingly used, especially the previous decade, 2010s, even in 2015, you mentioned already this co-edited by Søren volume on material koine of the early Iron Age and the Archaic period. And I think since you asked earlier for if it's possible to provide a definition, that in this conference there was the key speaker, invited key speaker was the anthropologist Michael Dittler, and I think that he came up with a really nice and concise definition that material culture koine is actually the emergence of common patterns on a pan-regional level in material styles. So I think that this packs really nicely what we have here, what we're dealing here, and what we apply to also in the area of ceramics.
Focusing more on ceramics, okay, as I know is the area of specialization of for both pottery. So how you would describe these commonalities in pottery and their extent or dominance, if you prefer, over a large geographical area such as the Hellenistic world?
Yes. First of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that this term is really difficult to grasp, I think. But in Hellenistic times, it's really, that's where what you mentioned before, Alexandros, that it was remarkable that it was to be employed sort of with any regularity in the Hellenistic period so late is actually quite surprising, because that's where we see a lot. What you just mentioned, Michael Dietler's definition is pan-regional commonality in pottery, and that's really what we begin to see very clearly, or most clearly, in the Hellenistic period, I should say, with, for example, the classical cantharos type from Athens, and that shape is being copied and distributed over a larger area, and also another prominent type of pottery that comes to mind is the Megarian bowls, or the so-called mold-made bowls that the end of the 3rd century BC, they really begin supposedly from Athens, and then that technology spreads wide. And it's just to add, it's a phenomenon that we not only see in pottery, but we see it in architecture and in mosaics and sculpture as well. So in the Hellenistic period, after Alexander and the expansion of the Greek world, we presume to identify also a spread in the commonality of pottery, and the reasons why. We can come back to discuss a bit about the reasons, but that's what makes, I think, the Hellenistic period particularly interesting for that.
Yeah, for sure. If I may add, it is, many people have been able to speak of Hellenistic ceramic koine quite early, but it has always been very troubling, very challenging to try and pin down exactly define what exactly this koine is. And this is no surprise at all, because first it concerns a very wide geographically area. The Hellenistic period spans about 3 centuries, and it is only logical to assume that there are going to be a lot of fluctuations in what we call the Hellenistic ceramic koine. It's not going to be exactly the same in every region. So it's very difficult, and it was one of the challenges that I had to work with when I decided to work on this topic through my dissertation. And it became clear in my mind that from very early stages, that if we are to make something out of this, we need to find a way to bring all of this information together. And I devised, for that reason, a very extensive database. In my mind was the first step and the most important step, in which I include more than 12,000 vases and sherds, published always. And at that point I should add that and say that any discussion or provision of definition of the Hellenistic ceramic koine would have probably been impossible to be done 20 or 30 years ago. It's been only now we have that the proliferation of published material is such that allows for such synthetic works to be accomplished, especially through the initiation of conferences such as the scientific conferences on Hellenistic pottery starting in 1986. More recently, there are other attempts of ERPOT, another association for the study of Hellenistic pottery, and these actually helped a lot to increase the material, the published material of pottery available to anyone to do more synthetic work. Also, maybe I should add here that not all ceramic evidence from the Hellenistic period is equally easily accessible to study this phenomenon or concept, if you want, because, for example, there are categories such as cooking ware or courseware that do not change as much throughout the centuries. They are not as culturally charged as tableware, for example, and that is why most of our discussion focuses around tableware, and this is where my own research is revolving around. And it's also one very important reason is that for the most part people have been studying and publishing this kind of material. So this is what we have available to work with.
Can I add something?
Sure.
Because yes, I again congratulate you on your work, because it's really a huge and remarkable work you've done with Hellenistic pottery, assembling this huge database. And that's really an accomplishment. But I was wondering, I don't know if you wanted to say something about, how you identify the koine in your study.
Yes,
yeah.
You refer to the methodology.
Yeah, so
form,
methodology.
right? Yes, of course, that's important. We have to, in my opinion, we have to start in a closer geographical region, try to study the pottery, the published pottery from that region, in order to come up with the ceramic footprint of that area. And then once we have established a ceramic character for several areas, then we are in a position to compare with each other, and whenever we have some similarities, this is going to mark one characteristic, one feature of the Hellenistic ceramic koine, with a lot of fluctuations, of course, here and there, but this is in just a couple of sentences what is the process followed in that research. And in my opinion, that's possibly the only way to do it.
I think one of the problems that you mentioned, the fluctuations, is that it's not, when we talk about koine, commonality in pottery production, of course we have to keep in mind that it's a dynamic process, a dynamic phenomenon that changes from geographical extent for different periods, and relates to which types are imitated and adopted in different areas, and also which shapes are abandoned at certain points. So, and this is as continuously as your work is also exemplifying, this continuously changing, which makes it very difficult to grasp this. What exactly do we mean by koine? Because it seems like in every half century, as we can identify it ceramically, it's something different. So it's very fluid.
It is. Sometimes it's like reading the clouds.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
And in some cases, and what is difficult here and challenging, and you need to set some ground rules from the very start, is what exactly marks a feature of the Hellenistic ceramic koine. For example, some certain shapes are going to be found everywhere, but the percentage of that shapes are going to change from one area to the other. Below what certain point, percentage-wise, are we going to say that this is not enough for this area in that respect to be added in the Hellenistic ceramic koine or not? So these are all thorny aspects of this research, and that is why these ground rules need to be placed from the beginning, so that we can come up with some, as much as possible, sound conclusions. Well, also, I feel that if we are to speak about the Hellenistic ceramic koine, one thing that we did not mention, probably we have to, is that it's not, as a phenomenon, does not start out of the blue. There is, in the 4th century, we have something, as you mentioned before, the Euboean koine, or the Bronze Age, the Iron Age koine, etc. We also have something that we call the Attic koine, right? And this is the 4th century Attic pottery that, due to the importance in terms of politics and also and mostly commerce of Athens, this Attic pottery can be found all over the Aegean and even beyond. And in fact, in the very first, and the Hellenistic ceramic koine owes a lot to this Attic koine, and in the very first steps of the Hellenistic ceramic koine, that is late 4th, early 3rd, it's many times difficult to differentiate between this Attic koine and the early stages of the Hellenistic koine. Later on, of course, starting in the early 3rd century BC, we have the gradual proliferation of local workshops around the Aegean, which gradually start to produce pottery with their own distinct local character within the wider umbrella of this ceramic koine. But at the very early stages, this Hellenistic ceramic koine is sometimes maybe indistinguishable from the Attic ceramic koine.
Do you see any exceptions to the above described situation, where at least pottery assemblage with specific characteristics can be defined as the Hellenistic koine deviate, or Do you see any local hybrids or selective adoption of specific traits?
Yeah, yeah. This is where the things get interesting.
Yes, I just want to, because I was thinking that really it depends very much on how we define Koine. You mentioned the methodology, and what deviates from the Koine. It depends on how we define the Koine. So that you talked about the percentages of different shapes at different size, so that can be one parameter.
Or the presence of, or absence of shapes in some areas.
Or exactly, style is a very difficult topic, but when are two styles so similar that we can say that it should fall under the concept of Koine. But for sure, there are many deviations from Koine through time, and I think that's one of the issues, sort of methodological issues, also a theoretical issue, that how do we define those deviations, and I know that's something that you've been working with.
Yes, actually I prepared a couple of slides about this. So there are deviations for sure. There are actually people, researchers, that pay a lot of attention to these deviations, and because of that they speak of local pottery production in the Hellenistic times, and therefore they even negate, they reject the concept of the Hellenistic ceramic Koine. One of those people is Jean-Paul Morel, who pays more attention to the heterogeneity in the Hellenistic period pottery, and focuses on the many local workshops, on the distinct shapes that can be found in some areas and are missing from other areas, and because of that he speaks of a prétendu in French Koine, so not a real one, but maybe a phenomenon that we think of. More recently I was reading of another opinion by Mark van der Enden, and he was describing the concept of the Hellenistic ceramic Koine mostly as a superficial veil that covers the local ceramic traits that are very distinctively found in distinct areas. But in my opinion, these are all valid, really valid opinions and thoughts. But the thing is that if we are to focus so much on all of these particularities, local particularities, then we might start losing the bigger picture, because what are we going to do with all of these similarities? Because there are a lot, nobody disagrees in that, and in my opinion the best way forward is a two-pronged approach. First, we need to focus on a local level and try to figure out what is, as I said before, the footprint, the ceramic footprint of an area, and then take a step back, zoom out a little bit, and focus on with an adjusted level of scrutiny. I think that this is the key factor here, and try to see the bigger picture. There are always going to be some local ceramic particularities for various reasons. Probably the first and most important one being ceramic tradition, local ceramic tradition. Second, maybe being the acceptance or rejection of local population to exogenous ceramic trends. Right? So these things are always going to be there, but at the same time we have all of these similarities. So if we adjust the level of scrutiny we apply to the material we study, then I think we can combine both seemingly opposing approaches and come up with a working definition of the Hellenistic ceramic Koine.
I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's the most interesting thing analytically. Interpretive is also in the differences, and where, to what extent certain productions, certain sites ascribe to the Koine and they deviate from it. I mean, that's where we can actually analytically say something about it. Yeah, I don't know if the next slide, I didn't prepare anything, but perhaps it's, yes.
And we have a lot of deviations. Right?
Yes, so that's, yeah, here's some of these deviations, we might call them, from the larger pan-regional koine. But actually, I was thinking, I wanted to mention another case I was just thinking about. It's the Hellenistic, the fish plate, which also becomes very widespread in the 3rd century. And I didn't prepare a slide for this, but having worked also in the Black Sea area, it's that shape is also adopted there and imitated. But in a local reduction-fired greyware pottery. So there we have the shape is imitated or adopted, but it's not the decoration and not the technique. And also one of the things that I have noticed on these fish plates from the Black Sea colonies is that many of them have cut marks on them. So they've been used as for plates that cut something on them, and which is something that I don't really, as far as I know, see in the sort of fish plates from Greece. So there might also be there an indication of different use of similar shapes. So use is a different, more difficult thing to pinpoint and to take into account of in a koine, but maybe that's also a factor. So I was just thinking about that. But then here, there's also the so-called Canadian two-handled carinated cups, the lower one there, and this Ionian type mold-made bowls, which have, as very well indicated here, a limited distribution in the Aegean and the western coast of Asia Minor, and also continues up into the Black Sea area. So you do find examples, few examples in most of the rest of Greece, but they're really sort of concentrated in that area. Most of the production was of the mold-made bowls from Ephesus, I believe, and Canadian cups from Cnidus. So that's one example there that really shows a sort of a deviation from a larger Hellenistic koine. So that's underneath. Perhaps you can say that it's underneath that veil that you mentioned before.
Yeah, I like using this kind of graph, having a big circle for the Hellenistic ceramic koine, and then smaller circles for these areas which present something slightly different, but at the same time they participate in this koine, but in their own selective or eclectic way sometimes. And I like to call these areas with these deviations Hellenistic ceramic dialects, because they operate within the koine. But as you can see, one of the circles is more participating more in this bigger one, the other one a little less, because it has more deviations, it presents more deviations from the Hellenistic ceramic koine. And yes, there are a lot of examples. So here we can speak of Central Greece ceramic dialect. We have these so-called hexamelia vases, the camphor and the cups, or this carinated two-handled cup. And even though there is this core area for these vases, and they have some distribution, this distribution is not very extensive, and that is why we can define this area of diffusion and speak of Central Greece ceramic dialect. The same applies here in the so-called Western Greece ceramic dialect, in which Epirus, Etelocarnania, and the western part of the Peloponnese more or less participate. But if we are to make the picture even a little bit more complex, to see how these things can get sometimes out of hand, even within these ceramic dialects, we can find core areas where something else is going on, like here or here in Avrakia. And to come up with another, even one more term, I call this ceramic neighborhoods. So we have all of these interpretative difficulties, and these ceramic dialects do exist definitely, and they invite some interpretations. Right? They ask for some interpretation.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, you gave us a very detailed picture of koine, of all these commonalities and the local divergency of pottery in the Hellenistic world. But my next question is, why do you believe that this phenomenon or concept as you define it is important, and specifically why it's important for the study of the Hellenistic world?
Yes, let me start by saying that first of all, it's an analytical heuristic tool which is quite useful for archaeologists. For example, there have been many colleagues when they study the material of the Hellenistic pottery material that they have from their own respective areas, referring to the Hellenistic ceramic koine without really having the same view of what this koine is all about, because everyone has a slightly or less likely different opinion of what this koine entails, and that was one of the incentives for me to work on this material and try to come up with a definition of that koine over time, and at least within the area of the modern state of Greece and concerning tableware. But you're right, it's not this koine per se that matters. Even though it is an interesting and useful tool, it's not this koine that matters. In my opinion, it is the deviations from this koine that matter more. Because whenever you can identify differences or deviations or particularities from that koine, then you can start thinking, exploring possibilities from an interpretative standpoint of why you do have these deviations, and many times these deviations mark a different response from the local population in social or economic matters. So I think that this is the main reason why it is viable while working on the Hellenistic pottery of an area, try to keep an eye in the wider picture and try to identify possible differences and then try to explain them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Koine, one of the things that really attracts me with the concept of koine is that it kind of forces us to think about pottery in a different way, because up until now we've been talking mostly about koine as a descriptive term to describe commonalities, but really, as you indicate, it's about,
it has applications.
Yes, as a descriptive term, it doesn't really have any explanatory power. So, but what becomes interesting is then, as you mentioned, to try to understand why are there these local dialects, as you call them, and I think also, although it's more difficult to investigate, but it's also interesting to think about the places that actually ascribe to the koine. I think there we sort of analytically we're moving into consumption, and mentioned before Michael Dietler's work on consumption, and I think that's a very good approach. And at the core of it, I think it's about the value of pottery. The value of pottery in the ancient society, but also the value of pottery as an analytical tool for us, and the ancient symbolic value of pottery. And I think sort of we have quite a lot of evidence, I would say, for the importance of pottery, the symbolic importance of pottery. So that allows us to, as a starting point, to talk about these. There is some kind of rationale behind the local dialects and what they adopt and what they don't adopt. Because, for example, we can mention Cicero when he was proconsul in Cilicia, and he was writing to his friend Atticus and asking or telling him that I've ordered these vasa rosica that you wanted me to get for you specifically. So that's one case of, if you're connected through a network, you can get specific ceramics that are unavailable to other people. And remember also Pliny the Elder is talking about sort of the value of early of sigillata pottery and places that produce sigillata pottery, as at Etso, for example. He described it something like an honor to the place, credit to the place that they're producing this nice pottery, and can mention many other examples of such sort of special values ascribed to pottery. So I think there is, it's sort of very difficult to, we just have these small glimpses into the value of pottery, and then trying to figure out the mechanisms behind this adoption of ascribing to the Koine or not local dialects is what's
and we can think of many examples, and if we keep this in mind, we can always come up with similar or different explanations on why this happens, and we think there are many parameters there. We need to be careful of the context, right? You mentioned before pottery from sanctuaries, but probably the Koine is going to be different in a sacred context than in a residential or funerary one. So the pottery is going to be different in these cases. So we have examples. I can give you a couple of examples of how this concept of the Koine and the deviations from it can help inform our approach and explanation, interpretations of Hellenistic pottery. So, for example, I'm working this time on Hellenistic pottery, late classical Hellenistic pottery from Maronia, and what I'm finding there is that even though I cannot say that this area is not participating in the Hellenistic ceramic Koine, because none of these shapes that I find there is not included in the Koine, they're all included there, but at the same time there are some conspicuous absences. In the late classical period, I have almost no Attic type scyphoi, Corinthian type scyphoi, there's only the campharoi. Later, from the mid 3rd century onwards, of course, I also have the advent there of Hellenistic type campharoi, but it's a very specific type. The angular and the S-shaped ones, which can be found in surrounding areas such as Pergamon, in Eastern Macedonia, in Ilion, which in my eyes also rings a bell for probably another local dialect. So taking into consideration all of this and others, so for example, we did mention the importance of the mold-made bowls from the late 3rd century throughout the 2nd century and well into the 1st century BC of mold-made bowls, but I have none so far in Maronia, which is striking. So all this make me think, taking into consideration how this picture deviates from what we have universally speaking about Greece, make me think that if not all of the Maronians, at least the ones using in this residential context assemblage that I'm working on, had probably a selective and a collective approach to what they were going to use, either imported or locally produced. And we can come up with several examples like this, and it gets even more complicated, but if you want my opinion, even more interesting, when we start moving outside the core area of Greece, because in that case, more questions, interesting questions, can get into the mix, such as identity, because we don't speak about Greek populations anymore, reception, appropriation, and stuff like that, which makes the picture even more complex, but in my opinion, more interesting as well.
Yes, and not to forget the itinerant potters also. I mean, I'm thinking, it's also, what does this mean? This Koine, the commonality in pottery, and it's sort of. I think it's important to remember that we have to investigate and explore sort of each site individually, to try to discover some of the possible social mechanisms, as you're talking about, that leads to the adoption or rejection of different types of pottery, because there has been in research this sort of I'd say lack of attention to the details, and just sort of the reason why we have commonality in pottery here is because there's trade contacts, or there's some kind of cultural unity or political hegemony or something like that. So, which is really sort of also just descriptive terms and not really. You have to get into the details of things, and for that we need even more assemblages, even more pottery.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need more assemblages, and we need them to be studied in a certain way. And if we are to make sense out of it, we need to start small. As you mentioned before, it's important to try and let the material give us the picture of the local ceramic character, and then try to compare and contrast it with the bigger picture.
Yes. I'm reminded of, just again coming back to the Black Sea area, because I know this material a bit, but if we look at the colonies in South Italy and the colonies in the Black Sea, the Greek colonies there, it's really remarkable. I think that the different shapes of Greek pottery throughout the archaic, classical, and Hellenistic period, they are imitated in the local production in the Black Sea colonies to a large extent, but not the decoration. It's in reduction-fired pottery. It's a greyware pottery. So that technology just continues throughout the different the centuries and the periods, but the shapes are changing, and they're adopting new shapes from Greece. But then if we look at the colonies in South Italy, they are copying the black figure and red figure and East Greek and West Slope, and so it's there seems to be completely different adoptions there and different patterns going on in the two colonial spheres, which I find very interesting. And the question is then, how does that apply to issues of identity? And
yes,
that's very, I don't
so
know.
the responses of local populations are going to be different, and both of the examples that you provide concern colonies that were founded by Greeks. If we take another example of outside the core area of Greece, so I'm thinking of the archaeological site of Kala Krsevica in Serbia, which is between the Celts and the Greeks. Over there we have a lot of importation, a respectable amount of Greek pottery imports, and also imitation of them, but in that case it's the opposite. So they copy the shape, but they apply, the surface treatment is different than it is in the Greek world, the narrow Greek world. So they're going, for example, to have same types of jugs or in hoe, but decorated in a way that simply cannot be found usually in Greece. So
why?
Yes, why?
That's
So
the big question.
It begs an answer why this happened.
And this is actually my next question, because you have so far convincingly argued about the value of the concept or phenomenon of Hellenistic koine as a research, as a heuristic tool. But is there any use of it beyond studying pottery styles, typology, decoration, production techniques? I mean, how can we use it, for example, to further our understanding, our interpretation of local, social, and cultural identities?
Yeah, that's the big question. And as we were just discussing a bit, it's I think you have to do it on a very sort of local basis, and I like to think that it's about also comparing the consumption of pottery to consumptions in other materials. So, for example, when we see a site that ascribes to a large extent to the koine, then is that also the case, for example, with terracotta figurines? Or do we see it in architecture, in other mosaics, or in other types of material culture? So that kind of comparative approach, I think, it's very useful, but it requires one to move outside of
His
let's say
comfort zone.
the comfort zone of
Comfort zone.
pottery.
Yeah.
So then it's to invite people working on other materials to participate in this discussion.
Yeah.
So that's I think that's one approach that is needed in the
Yeah.
future.
I agree. If I am to put it slightly differently, I would say contextualization.
Yes,
So
yes.
we need to bring together material culture of different forms, not only pottery, compare it with the general picture we have here, try to explain these deviations on the basis not only of pottery, but pottery in conjunction with all of these other different types of material culture, maybe terracotta, inscriptions, use, of course, written sources whenever available, descriptions, and if researchers are not able or willing to step outside their comfort zone, then maybe the answer is the formation of interdisciplinary groups.
Yes,
Right.
certainly. Mm.
Yeah. That can work together towards a common goal.
So the concept of koine, or the phenomenon of koine, is employed in the study of the Hellenistic world comes a long way. It's an old concept. Do you see it developing, or if it can be adjusted, next to or alongside or in intersection with new research tools, new research methodologies, which could facilitate our efforts to study local social and cultural identities?
Yes, you're right to say that this is an old concept, right? We mentioned before that the first to use it, Werner Technau, was in 1929. Of course, the picture he had was much more limited than now, but still, in that early period, he was able to identify all of the similarities. It is an old concept, but at the same time, I have the feeling that we haven't exploited the way we should or could. And there is a lot of information that we can still squeeze out of it, and as we mentioned before, mostly out of the deviations that can be observed from this koine. Now, in terms of new tools, I would say that we need to step away from simply, when we study pottery, from simply cherry picking the most beautiful or characteristic shapes and present only them because they are more aesthetically pleasing, or they are the ones that do provide chronology dating, which is usually or always, maybe pottery or any other kind of material culture, the number one objective, right, usually. So we need to move a step further from that and use more statistical analysis, because it's not as beautiful doing so, but we can tease out a lot of information out of these statistics of shapes that are there, are not there, are there but in very small percentages, and we can get a lot of information from there, information already available, but not always exploited the way we should.
No, yeah, definitely. I agree that we simply need more fully published assemblages of pottery, and as we know, that's very time consuming, and we need a lot of resources and expertise on projects to do that. You're asking about new tools.
New tools.
Yeah.
And how it can be used, the concept of
Yes, and we were talking a little bit earlier today and about digital tools and scanning, and that might be yes, and scanning of pottery fragments, for example, might be a way forward in the future to produce section drawings of a lot of pottery quite fast. I think there have been some experiments and some preliminary success with scanning pottery to produce technical drawings, or technical illustration, let's say. But it's not quite there yet. There are some difficulties. We kind of still need the human factor for studying pottery, which in a sense is nice, but it's also perhaps what's keeping us back a bit. That might be one tool.
Yes. I mean, statistical analysis I mentioned before, quantification, it's not really new tools, but they haven't been applied very much in Hellenistic pottery or in studies of Greek pottery for that matter in general. So that's one way forward.
Yes. Also, perhaps we should also, again, not a new tool, but sort of chemical characterization is, I think, also something need to do even more. I mean, it's that field is progressing, has progressed a lot, and a lot of very, very interesting work is being done. But I think much more is needed there, because when we go into these details of the local level, you really need chemical characterization of the chemical fingerprints of the productions also, because to talk about consumption and identity, we also need to know what are actually the local productions, the different workshops. So that, and now with these handheld portable XRF devices, for example, that might be, that it would be beneficial, I think, if that more people use that.
Yes, I agree, because first of all, let me say that all of these areas in Greece are not evenly represented in bibliography for Hellenistic pottery. Not at all, but even for the best represented area, which is Macedonia, northern Greece, even there we are still very far behind in terms of all of these analytical tools that you were discussing about. So we still need to learn a lot of things about workshops in the regional or extra-regional communication, and to do that we're going to need the help of tools, archaeometrical tools, and that's definitely one way forward that we need to pursue.
So would you, I want to say, do you want to go as far as say that, there's a huge need in the field actually for pottery specialists still? I mean, it's I sometimes pottery can by some people be perceived as a kind of tedious and perhaps a bit boring work, but I think this discussion is it really shows that there's a lot of work to still be done.
It is, and many times it's not as an attractive work or material to work with as something else, like sculpture, for example, for some people, they find it more attractive to work with. But it depends on how we define pottery specialist, because in my opinion, yes, you might be right that not as many people do that exclusively. What it happens for the most part is people do that as a side occupation. And this is exactly because of the omnipresent character of pottery. It's everywhere, and you can't really get around it. If you want to work on the material evidence of an area, you really need to work on the pottery, and there are only so many people doing this exclusively, so you can't always bring somebody in. You need to work sometimes on your own material, even if you have no area of specialty.
Yes.
So there are many people that are trained to do a little bit of everything, right? So especially people working in the F-rates, the Greek Archaeological Service, you need to be able to work on a little bit of everything: sculpture, coins, inscriptions, pottery. So.
But isn't that the biggest problem, that a lot of ceramics are not published? I mean, I know I have excavated a kiln in Samos from the Hellenistic age 20 years ago. It's not published yet. I know the enormous amount of ceramics that are inside the museums.
It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and what Søren mentioned before, using 3D tools for drawing, it's not like it's going to give us an immediate response in something, but it's going to allow us move faster. Because it takes time, and if you don't have the budget or the people that are going to work next to you and do that for you, and you have to do it on your own, it takes time. I mean, you might need a couple of weeks to go through a medium-sized pottery resemblance, and then another week or so to do the drawings, and half a week to photograph them. So,
Yes, in the best case.
in the best case, yeah.
So I think we have time for one last question.
We can open it up if you want.
Yes. Okay, so my last question is kind of relevant and irrelevant at the same time. I mean, it's more to the reflexive side okay, of what you do, and I came up with this, based on the concept of NIA-logues, bringing people together, making them, think about what they do in the kind of intersection with their interlocutor. So you both come from different backgrounds, studying the same topic of a vast geographical area with all these local idiosyncrasies. So how do you think your personal engagements, your own personal background, affects the way that you treat the koine? I think you had the time, to understand it.
I guess that this is a big part of what defines us as researchers. This is our educational background. So, speaking personally, and you know that because with Paschalis we share the same alma maters, right? we're both graduates of the Aristotelic University of Thessaloniki, and then later on graduates of UC at Cincinnati. So I can speak for myself and say that this is really important. What is the background educationally that you take, and this is going to inform in a great degree what your approach to the material is going to be. In my case, the Greek educational system, I don't know if it's exactly the same here in Athens, or it used to be because these things tend to change, is very data focused. A lot of focus on learning very well your material, your stuff, after you've been trained rigorously on the historical background of the period that you're going to specialize on. Later on, moving to the States, I was able to inform my study a little bit more with theory. And actually, to be honest, I knew that I had already a good enough background in terms of actual knowledge of the material, typology, dating, stuff like that. But I was allowed, the way the system works, to free myself a little bit and work more on the interpretive aspect of things, because sometimes we forget that we don't do archaeology for archaeology, as we say. I at least, view archaeology as a child of history. So doing archaeology, we have to keep in mind that we need to add something into what is called Hellenistic history. It might be just a really, really small stone, right? But it is what it is, and in terms of what the material offers you. Sometimes you might be able to offer something more significant. But we need to keep in mind that it's not only archaeology for archaeology. We need to try every time to doubt ourselves and ask questions to the material we have in front of us. I don't know if I covered.
Sort of diplomatically.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to think about, but I agree with you, of course, that what you said, that we are influenced by our educational background very much so, but our approach to archaeology and material culture and pottery specifically can also sort of be informed by kind of a reaction to our educational system. And I think in my case, in Scandinavia, it's we don't have the material, and not so much anyway. And the educational system is not the primary purpose of the educational system in let's say, Mediterranean archaeology in Scandinavia is not to educate students to work with the local Greek archaeological authorities. So there is a more theoretical perspective there. And I was fortunate enough because other people invited me and helped me to be able to work a lot already as a student with pottery. And in the beginning, when you start this work, you're just, you know, if you can identify pottery from a small fragment, you can identify complete shapes, and you can start dating it. You know, for a long time, that satisfies your immediate needs. But then eventually, you know, it's not enough, and you start thinking about the social
implications.
Yeah, the social implications and questions of identity, and how can we actually methodologically use pottery to say something more than simply just dating or connections. So yeah, I think, try to answer your question, I'm probably, you know, my interest in koine is the social mechanisms behind the adoption and consumption of pottery stems perhaps from the fact that I, you know, have a long engaged with pottery for a long period of time, and then eventually you sort of, yeah, it's not enough just to date to use the pottery to date the context in your excavation. You want to say something more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally agree.
Right. So after working together and discussing for this occasion the past months, and I have to note that Søren and Alexandros knew each other only bibliographically before that.
Yeah.
So my final question is what do you think now with all these differences in your background and engagements? Is there one classical archaeology or more than one? And this is my final question.
Do you want me to be diplomatic again? I'd say one classical archaeology with many faces.
With local idiosyncrasies.
Yes.
Local dialects.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. No, I fully agree with that, and I think that's a good thing. I think really that diversity is very good, and that emphasizes also, I think, the importance of this NIA-logues. You know, we didn't know each other personally before,
Yes.
so I mean, bringing perhaps different traditions together is very important. So it's a real pleasure to be sort of involved in this enterprise that hopefully the Institute will be able to continue in the future.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I totally agree. There is always the different background is going to make probably for a different approach, and then there are also some the circumstances. Right? It's totally different for somebody studying and working in Greece, especially if he's part of the Euphoria, and for somebody that comes from foreign school in terms of permits. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody coming from abroad, they need to adjust their focus and what they're going to work on for how long. But at the end, we have the same passion. We share the same passion for this kind of material. And in many cases, you can see the same trends applied everywhere. So we were discussing earlier, if you remember, that it's a nice thing that we see with some delay in classical archaeology. Prehistorians are always faster in this, but we see this opening into science that it's a step that it's probably the next logical step, and to some extent we need to use it whenever it is useful and effective for research.
Thank you both. I have no further questions, so I guess it's time for our audience to say yes. So any questions for Alexandros and Søren? Søren and Alexandros, please.
Well, I'm interested in where the shapes of the koine come from? I mean, from the beginning, Alexandros, you talked about there's the Attic koine, and Attic, of course, is a powerhouse of ceramics. But later on, in the late 3rd century, when Athens is really not a very considerable place, nonetheless, what seems to be an Athenian invention, the mold-made bowl, also enters the koine. But of course, there are other things that enter the koine from other places, and I wondered if you've thought about mapping that and what that would mean. Is that, what are the driving forces? Is it politics? Is it commerce? Is it movement of cars? I don't even know of maps of that set of phenomena, but
Yeah,
it seems it would be interesting.
That's very interesting. I had never thought of it this way. I mean, of course, when we speak of a new introduction to the koine, we're going to discuss about the shape, we're going to think of what is skin, but I never thought of bringing all of this evidence together and try to make out of it. Yes, there are shapes, and for some of them there are theories where they're coming from. So, for example, we have late in the 3rd century the introduction of the Macedonian type amphora. The name is more or less self-explanatory. We have these cups that you spoke, the Credian cups, the Ionian type mold-made bowls, Laginoan. So there is this other category of the pseudo-Cypriot, nobody knows yet where they're, at least with any level, any degree of certainty, where they're coming from. It's a big discussion whether we can assign this to politics, and so far whenever I try to tackle this topic, I've come up with the conclusion that it's not set in stone. Sometimes it seems that politics do play a role. I think that's the case with at least the theory right now about the mold-made bowls. That's how they first entered Athens, and they became so widespread afterwards. But in other instances, and I'm thinking of the work of John Lude in Cyprus, it seems that they haven't played this much of a role. In other instances, Mark Laval has spoken about politics, how soldiers have been moving around with pottery with them, and we might think that they are responsible for some of this pottery being introduced in an area and then picking up in popularity. But it's interesting to try, for anyone to try to see this ceramic evidence from that perspective. And I don't think that anybody has done it.
No, I think you raise a very good point and a very interesting point, but also a very difficult one because, and I'm reminded of the Campanian pottery, Campania A pottery. I studied a bit, and its distribution in the Aegean and the Black Sea, and it seems like there's the sort of second half of the 2nd century BC into the beginning of the 1st century, it seems to be a sought after type of pottery, because it's very difficult to evaluate style, but it's definitely well fired for that period. It's one of the more, let's call it, exclusive pottery of that period, and I think trying to, as you say, map the networks of where this pottery goes, especially for Campania. Delos seems to be a hub or a node for the distribution of Campania A pottery, and then it goes to specific places, and perhaps it is possible to trace some of such networks. But this is sort of not the production of or imitation of new types of pottery, but consumption of just imported pottery. Yeah. I think networks.
I'm just thinking that Alexandros' database, as it grows, as I suppose it will,
it still grows.
Now it's part may begin to make that more feasible, because what we might not have noticed before, that a new shape is entering the koine and is moving out of its regional area
Yeah.
will become clear with the bigger view that you can give us with the database.
Yes, yes. I guess that such a study or such an approach could revolve around several axes. So, for example, politics, itinerant potters, or simply imports, and then local imitation. And in terms of how this could work or proceed, I think that it only, sometimes, if we can pinpoint the initial area of diffusion, so where shape starts, then we can try and move forward and start testing what might be the case in that scenario. So is it politics in that case? Is it something else? And try to work around our way around sources and other kind of evidence. But sometimes the problem is that we can't even pinpoint an area of diffusion. So in these cases, it starts even before, it stops even before it starts. So,
but that's also about chronological integrity. It's very important for the, so still we have very, in many cases, only very broad contextual datings per many times. So,
yeah.
but I'm thinking then, to trace this, you would have to include in your database an even larger geographical area, perhaps the east, more in the east. Do you have any plans to do that? It's a huge. That would be.
It's a huge work. Yes. So what I'm currently it includes almost everything that has been. Susan knows this already. Probably most of you don't know, but Susan was part of my committee, so she knows firsthand all of these issues, and we've discussed this in detail previously. So currently it includes almost everything that has been published in terms of monographs, papers within Greece, and several things that were included in the scientific meetings on Hellenistic pottery and concerned the Lower Balkans. So a little bit of Serbia, Albania, and North Macedonia, and I'm going to include more about these areas. Regretfully, there are not as many, as you know, especially when it comes to these Lower Balkan areas, which on the other hand makes it easier to include them. And my hope is that I'm going to be able to, at some point, make it available online for everybody to work, and then in a certain setting to make it available for people to add stuff. So once this is done, then we can have more stuff from the eastern coast from the western coast of Asia Minor, because there is a lot of Hellenistic pottery coming from these areas, of course.
That's a very good idea.
Yeah, that's the plan right now.
This answers my question about new research tools.
Yeah.
Open access databases, because this is not one research. It's,
again, not
it takes
really
two lifetimes to do it.
Yeah, not a really new kind of tool, and already there are a few. There are a few cases like this, but nothing concerning Greece. And Greece is the area that has been, in my view, worked more in terms of Hellenistic pottery than any other area. So it makes sense to have something for Greece. I mean, Adra Berlin hasn't done something for Asia Minor.
The Levantine area, really, it doesn't get into Greece at all. It's really
it's mostly
Israel
for
and
Middle
getting up
for
into
Middle East.
Asia Minor, but
So it's mostly for Middle East.
mostly she began in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. I mean, and it can be expanded, of course.
Yeah.
Other questions for our speakers? Yes, please.
I've got a question about some case studies where perhaps this kind of context analysis of pottery and other kind of finds have been used, or also including like spatial analysis and perhaps scientific analysis of some kind of material. Did some case studies of this sort help to like assess better some information about pottery, Hellenistic pottery in general?
Ooh, I'm trying to think. The top of my head, I can't think of an example specifically. The contextual assemblage with scientific, talking about chemical characterization of pottery, but I can't think about an example right now. But I can tell you that I'm working at Caledon, and we have this idea to do an extensive chemical characterization, because there in Western Greece it's still it's a big problem. We can't really differentiate between. We have an idea of what the local production of pottery is, but there are some doubts, and that's the first thing that we need to sort out, so that we can actually move forward with this, because otherwise we're stuck at that level, what we can say. So it's definitely a very important step. Sure. If you have an example.
Yeah, I think I have something. In terms of scientific analysis on pottery, so chemical, geometric analysis, there is a growing tendency, and that's a good thing, for many people to conduct this sort of analysis. I think we're still very early in this process, and again, if we want this thing to work properly, then we need again to base everything on an open access online level, where we can include all of the archaeometric analysis, so that we can have some sort of petrographic identity for many different areas, and then new analysis that are going to be conducted can draw comparisons from there and also add their own information on there. So this is something that is happening. In terms of other tools that we were discussing before, such as statistical analysis, quantification, I can think recently of the study of Sarah James in Corinth. She did apply quantification methods to this material, coming up with some useful information, conclusions about it. I don't think this one was what we can really say contextualized everything, because it was solely focused on pottery, but we did see how useful can statistical analysis be. And again, that's something that we need to happen more and more, because for the time being we simply have very concise presentations of pottery. Most of the time, even when a catalog appears, this is going to include the most characteristic shapes, the most unique, the ones that provide more information on dating, or the ones that more useful to showcase, apart from dating, also decoration techniques and stuff. So yeah.
It sounds like a job for AI.
Yes, it does. Any other questions? All right. I have plenty, but I will save it for the reception.
Fair enough.
So let's thank Alexandros and Søren and Alexandros, okay, the pioneers of
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.